Hey guys, Richard Holder here. What modifications work on your 6.2 liter LS? Well, the best way to find out what mods work is to be prepared, and the way to be prepared is to watch this video. I've got all of the modifications on your favorite 6.2 liters. We're talking about the L92, the L99, and of course, the LS3. So I'm going to cover cylinder heads, camshafts, intake manifolds, headers, you name it, all kinds of modifications on the 6.2 liter. Let's check it out. In this video, we're going to take a look at all the popular modifications to the 6.2 liter engine family. We're talking about the L92, the L99, and of course, the LS3. Now, the two things that the 6.2 liter has going for it, first off, is displacement. It's 6.2 liters and not 6 liters like the smaller cathedral port stuff. 6.2 liters come from the increase in bore size because they all share basically the same stroke except for the little tiny 4.8 liter. So the 6.2 liter has displacement right off the bat, but the other thing that it has going for it are rectangular port cylinder heads. Right from the factory, these heads flow 315 or 316 CFM, which is enough to support way over 600 horsepower. In fact, we've made almost 700 horsepower with factory rectangular port heads. And yes, I know the smaller 6 liter, some of the 6 liter applications also share these rec port heads. So the modifications I'm going to show you on the 6.2 liter also carry over to those rec port 6 liter heads. But the 6.2 liter, L92, L99, and LS3 all can make a ton of power. Let's take a look at all the modifications we did to 6.2 liter combinations, including camshafts, cylinder heads, intake manifolds, and of course headers. Let's check them out. To get things started, we're going to take a look at modifications I made to an L92. Now, why are we looking at an L92 and not an LS3? Well, the reality is it's just numbers. I mean, GM made a lot more trucks. They made about a bazillion more trucks and SUVs than they ever did Camaros and Corvettes. So the L92 is going to be a lot more prevalent than an L99 or even the LS3. Now, I did a lot of testing on an LS3 crate motor supplied by the guys from GM Performance Parts and Gandrid Chevrolet. Thank you guys for that. It was awesome over the years. I did a ton of testing on it, but I also want to show you testing on the L92 because if you were going to go to the wrecking yard or buy one online, it's a lot cheaper to get an L92. And let's face it, it's every bit as good if you're going to change the camshaft any. It has the rectangular port heads and it has a truck LS3 style intake manifold on it. And here's an important note I'm going to show you later on in the intake testing. That truck intake makes every bit as much power as the fancy Corvette LS3 intake manifold, but this is an L92, and what we did, because I can't run VVT, and this motor originally would have had variable cam timing, I can't run that because we run all the stuff with an aftermarket ECU, and we weren't able to control the VVT cam, so we just stuck an LQ4 camshaft in this as our baseline. So we started out with a fixed cam position, and we ran a 6 liter truck cam. We ran it with long tube headers the way that we do, and we ran it with a Mazir electric water pump, but otherwise it was stock. It did have a valve spring upgrade because we were going to put a camshaft in it because the camshaft required, bigger valve springs. We just put a set of beehive springs in it and away we go. So run with long tube headers and our stock 6 liter cam, the stock 6 liter truck manifold. The other thing we had to do is put a manual throttle body on it and take the drive-by-wire throttle body. But the throttle body sizing was the same, and it was sized to match. It was a 92 millimeter throttle body, sized to match the opening on the truck manifold. So we produced, with our mild 6 liter cam, 445 horsepower and 460 foot-pounds of torque on our L92 truck motor. Here's what happened when we installed a camshaft upgrade. And the reason that we would put a camshaft upgrade on this, as you can see, we made a ton of power with just a cam, and that's why we do this on a 6.2 liter. The reason that we do a cam upgrade on this motor is because it already has everything else that it needs. It's got a lot of displacement, it has compression, it already has a really good cylinder head on the factory rec port head, and it also has a good intake manifold on. As I said, that truck manifold is every bit as good as an LS3 manifold, which we know is really good. But we installed this camshaft. This was a Summit Racing cam. It was a stage 4 cam. It was a 625/605 lift split, a 234/247 degree duration split on a 113 degree lobe separation angle. This is about as big a cam as you can fit with the available piston to valve clearance. We just installed the cam and it had it had enough piston to valve clearance for us to run it. But we upgraded the power output of our L92 from 445 horsepower with that LQ4 truck cam all the way up to 567 horsepower. Now, torque was way up too, from 460 foot-pounds to a peak of 509 foot-pounds of torque. So this is just a cam upgrade, which is why we show you. The cam should be the first thing that you should think about on any L92 because you get big gains. It already has the other things that it needs. Let's check out some LS3 stuff now. For some reason, the internet has decided that stock exhaust manifolds, short cast iron stock exhaust manifolds, or even tubular versions like shorty headers, were designed to improve low-speed power. Now, I'm not sure where this misconception came to be, but it is, in fact, a misconception. You see, long tube headers were actually designed to enhance low-speed power. They do that through scavenging. If you think about long tube headers in the same way that you think about long runner intake manifolds, long improves power down low. And in fact, in this case, long tube headers improve power everywhere, as we'll show, but this test was actually run on a 6-liter LY6, a rec port headed 6-liter, and not a 6.2 liter, although the gains would be very similar. We've run them on LS3 motors as well. But this was a test when I was running the Brian Tooley Racing various stage truck cams. This one was run on the stage 3, and I actually ran the long tube headers on everything from the stock cam stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3, and we compared them both ways with the stock exhaust manifolds and with long tube headers. And in every instance, the long tube headers obviously enhance power production. So this was the test run with the stock exhaust manifolds and a stage 3 cam on an LY6. And in this combination, it made 491 horsepower and 469 foot-pounds of torque. And we're not worried so much about the peak power numbers. I just wanted to illustrate to you what happens when you add long tube headers in place of stock exhaust manifolds. So here's what happened when we put a set of 1 3/4 long tube headers. I'm just going to verify that and make sure that it's not the 1 7/8 headers. Actually, these were the 1 7/8 long tube hooker swap headers that we run on everything with 18-inch collector extensions on them. So the red are the header combinations. So as you can see, we did pick up power everywhere. Out at the top, it was about 13 or 14 horsepower. But more importantly, look at the gains down here in the 3,000 to 3,500 RPM range. We're talking about going from 375 foot-pounds to 407. So it's a lot of torque down low. And as I said, long tube headers are actually best at enhancing torque production down low in this RPM range. And you can size the header with the primary length and diameter, and even you can change the collector and stuff to really greatly improve power down low, and also the length of the extension after the header. If you're running a full exhaust, that's good. It also does that. But remember, long tube headers definitely add low speed power in addition to adding power through the rest of the RPM range. Let's check out our next mods. For our next test, we're going to take a look at intake manifolds, because if we already have good cylinder heads and we add a camshaft to it, the next thing that we can look at is an LS3 intake manifold, which probably might arguably be the best factory intake manifold that they make. And by the way, and I know guys are going to ask, can't I run an LS3 intake manifold with adapters on a cathedral port head? And the answer is yes, you can, because they make the adapters for guys to put the LSA blowers on there. And while they work fairly well with a really short runner blower intake manifold at the right angle, that combination doesn't work well. Putting an LS3 intake manifold with adapters on a cathedral port head makes less power than the cathedral port intake manifold does. So if you're going to use a cathedral port head, it's better to use a cathedral port manifold, and the best one that you could put on there, probably a factory one, is a Trailblazer SS. The Dorman LS2 also works well, and obviously a fast. And then if you want more RPM, you use a short runner intake, which we're going to talk about on this. But I wanted to show you really quickly, this is a cammed LS3. It has a slightly milled factory LS3 head. It has the comp 469 camshaft in it, a set of 1 5 or 1 7/8 headers with extensions and no mufflers, and run with a stock LS3 intake. It made 580 horsepower and 528 foot-pounds of torque. I just wanted to show you real quickly the difference between the LS3 intake manifold and the truck version of the intake manifold. This was an LY6, but you can see there are slight differences at various parts on the curve, but they only differ by a couple of horsepower. In that distance, it's 4 or 5. And again, a little bit less here, a little bit more here, a little bit less here. But basically, the whole shape of the curve and everything is the same. And what I'm saying is, if you have an L92, or if you have a truck intake manifold and it fits, it will work every bit as good as the LS3. So if you're thinking about changing over, you won't get any power gain, but you might get fitment if you have to fit it under the hood. One of the problems with the factory LS3 intake is actually not a problem at all. It's just that it works so well. It's hard to improve upon. At least it's hard to improve upon throughout the entire RPM range. Now, it is possible to improve the power output compared to an LS3 intake manifold with a short runner intake at the top of the RPM range, but the problem is you normally sacrifice power other places in the curve. So I'm going to show you what happens when we compare the factory LS3 intake manifold to a couple of other intakes so you can see what you have what you have coming when you make an upgrade. Now this is our LS3 with a cam upgrade, the Comp 469 camshaft. It has a slightly milled head. It made 580 horsepower and 528 foot-pounds of torque. But here's what happened when we installed an Edelbrock Super Victor intake. Now this was a Super Victor 4500, so it had the big Dominator size flange on it. We ran it fuel injected with a big 4-hole Dominator style throttle body on it, and it did indeed make more power. I mean, it made 615 horsepower up from 580. So it made quite a bit more power at the peak, but as you can see, below 6,000 RPM, the factory LS3 manifold made a lot more power. I mean, torque was down to 504 foot-pounds with the short runner Super Victor intake manifold. Now, if you're running your motor out to 8,000 RPM and you're only going to be running from 6,000 to 8,000, the short runner manifold like this is going to work fairly well. But make sure to science out your combination and get it to run in the RPM range where that intake manifold is going to be a benefit. So now let's take a look at the other end of the spectrum here. We ran an Edelbrock cross ram intake, which is, it's the cross ram like this. It is a long runner intake manifold. It is a dual plenum and a dual throttle body. And I know a lot of guys are thinking, oh yeah, two 92 millimeter throttle bodies, that's going to help it flow. It's not a flow situation. It's actually just a runner design, and the runner length on the cross ram are longer than the factory intakes, which is why this thing makes more power down low. And it made more power all the way up to about 5,300 RPM. The peak torque on the cross ram was up to 543 foot-pounds. And then it actually dipped below the factory intake up to 6,100 RPM and then made more power at the top. So up here it made 590 horsepower, so it was up at the peak. So it made more peak power and peak torque. But obviously you have two throttle bodies. The setup is aluminum, it's cast. It's a little bit heavier obviously than a factory setup, but it does look awesome. So here's what happens when you change the intake manifolds on your LS3. We're going to take a look at one more combination, and I'm going to show you the actual effect of runner length. In the previous sets, I showed you what happens when we went from the factory LS3 intake manifold up to a short runner single plane like Super Victor with the 4500 flange on it. But I want to show you now what happens when you just change the runner length and keep all of the rest of the intake manifold the same. So once again, this is our LS3 that made 580 horsepower and 528 foot-pounds. But here's what happened when we put a adjustable fast manifold that had interchangeable runners so that we could actually change the runner length and keep everything else the same. The first one was the long runners that we're calling them. That's basically if you put a fast LS3 intake manifold the way that it comes from fast on your combination. It picked up maybe a little bit of power, 585 horsepower. But again, this is why we tell you on the rec port head stuff, I don't usually recommend putting a fast on that combination because it just doesn't gain you very much power compared to if you put a fast on a cathedral port application, you get a ton of power because it's a lot better than the factory stuff. But they did such a good job on the factory LS3 manifold that they just didn't leave a bunch on the table. But here's what happened when we go from the long runner, because they have 3 different runner lengths for the fast. They've got a long runner, a medium runner, and then a short runner. And here's what happened when we put the medium length runner on. Much like the Super Victor intake manifold or any short runner intake, when we shorten the runner length, we can improve power at the top of the RPM range, and it made 593 horsepower. But as you can see here in red, it lost power through most of the rest of the curve. And this is what you'll see with runner length. As you decrease the runner length, you're going to lose a ton of torque. So you want to have the runner length at the right length to optimize power production in the RPM range that you're going to be running the motor. So you can see with the medium runner length, we picked up power at the top, but lost power all the way up to 6,000 RPM. So I don't know if that would be a good trade-off. And here's the final thing when we put the even shorter runner on there. Again, we picked up more power at the top. We were over 600 horsepower, 603 horsepower. But once again, if you look at the red here, again, because it shifts when I make the change here. So we lost we lost torque all the way up to 6,500 RPM now compared to the factory LS3 or compared to the long runner on the fast manifold. So again, is that, excuse me, is the extra 10 horsepower at the top worth all of this loss down below? And that's one thing you have to think about when you're thinking about runner length on the intake manifold. Where do I want my power production? The single biggest gain you can add to your 6.2 liter, whether it's an L92, 99, or an LS3, is a camshaft. This is our factory LS3 crate motor from Gandred Chevrolet. It made 495 horsepower and 491 foot-pounds of torque. And a lot of guys might be thinking, hey, but it's rated at 430. Yes, because we test it differently than GM does. They test it with everything the way that it is in the car. They test it on an engine dyno, but with everything hooked up, all the accessories, all the air intake, all the exhaust, including the cats. They run the motor hot, and they run it with a factory tune. We run ours with an optimized tune with long tube headers and a collector extension. We run no accessories, and we run no air inlet. And obviously, this is what it makes. I've run a dozen of these, and this is what all of these, this is the power output that all of the LS3s make. It's, like I said, 495, 491 with the factory camshaft. And now let's take a look and see what happens when we upgrade our camshaft on an LS3. It already has good heads. It already has a good intake. So basically, this combination, even more than the other LS combinations, is just begging for a camshaft. So here's what happened when we put the smallest of our camshafts that we tested. This is a 224 cam, and I'll give you the specs on it. It is a 624 590 lift, 224 232 degree duration, and 113 degree lobe separation angle. As you can see, it made more power everywhere. Peak power was up to 547. Peak torque was up to 514 foot-pounds, and it even made about 30 extra foot-pounds down here around 3,000 or 3,100 RPM. So this camshaft added power everywhere, which is not uncommon for us to see on an LS3 application. But I want you to know also that although every cam that we tested now goes up in duration from the 224 cam, it basically gets wilder. If you were to put a cam in smaller than the 224, like a 210 or a 212 or 218, it would just make less than the 224, but more than the stock camshaft. It would be in the middle here somewhere, depending on what you chose on the duration. So here's what happened when we stepped up to a 227 cam. And I'll give you the specs on the 227 cam. 637, 612 lift, 227, 234 degree duration, and 113 degree lobe separation angle. And it's a slightly bigger camshaft, and it made slightly more power at the top. It made 555 horsepower. Torque was down a little bit down here at the bottom, but through the rest of the curve, they were essentially the same, all the way up to 52 or 5,300 RPM. So here's what happens when you put a wilder camshaft in. You get more power at the top of the RPM range. And it's important to note that a lot of guys think that a milder cam is going to get me a lot more torque in the middle. I don't care about the top end. I only care about the torque in the middle. Well, as you can see, that's not what happens. Even if you put a milder camshaft in this, a 210 cam, you're probably not going to pick up peak torque. As a matter of fact, you probably would lose peak torque on a cam that small. You might pick up torque down here in the 3,000 RPM range and below, but it's not going to be a lot. So now let's see what happens when we take a look at our 231 camshaft. This is a comp 54, let's see, it's a 259 cam. And that is a 614, 624 lift, 231, 239 degree duration, and 113 degree lobe separation angle. And for you rec port, cathedral port cam guys that are saying that's not the right cam for a rec port head, that's not accurate. I also ran the 469 cam, and the only thing that the 469 cam does with 247 degrees of exhaust duration increase from 239 on this 259 cam is it adds a little bit more power out here at the very top. And I'm not talking about a lot of peak power. I'm just talking about it extends it out a little bit farther and it loses a little bit down low. But like all of these, all of the rest of the curve, including the peak torque and this torque plateau, All of that is exactly the same with the 469 cam compared to the 459 cam. So this whole rec port, cathedral port cam stuff, I've got videos up on that, is just nonsense. Here's what they do. They all work well, and as we step up in camshaft, you pick up more power at the top. You've got about the same through most of the curve. You might sacrifice a little bit down low, and as I said, if you pick a smaller cam, it will be between the stock cam and the 224 cam. Let's get to our next mods. The final modification I want to talk to about the L92 or LS3 rec ported head 6.2 liter are cylinder heads. And the reason that I left that for last is, in my opinion, the factory cylinder head is already very good. And what will happen is if you upgrade the head to a ported head on a stock combination, you will get almost no power. And I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. This was our stock LS3 with a stock camshaft. And here's what happened after we put a ported, CNC ported L92 head from GM Performance Parts. As you can see, we only picked up about 10 horsepower or so, and we picked up a little bit here in the middle. And the reason for this isn't because the GM head isn't very good. I mean, we've made way over 700 horsepower with that ported GM head on a big LS3 combination, but that's just my point. You're not going to get a big power gain from a ported LS3 head, any ported LS3 head, not because they don't work. They do. They work very well, and they can support a lot of power, but because your combination doesn't yet need that flow. And that's because the factory head is already so good. I mean, it will already support way over 650 horsepower. In fact, like I said, we've made almost 700 on a big combination. So it will support that power level already in stock trim. So going to a ported one isn't going to get you big gains. So I wouldn't do it, obviously, on a stock one. I wouldn't upgrade the head. Really, even on a cammed LS3, you're going to start getting more gains on a cammed LS3. But where I would start looking at a ported LS3 head is if I went up in displacement. If you put a 4-inch stroke in there and made a 415 or a 416. But also, and more importantly, if you put a piston upgrade in this thing. If you're going to do a stroker, you're going to do this anyway. But put a piston that has valve relief in it, so now you can put enough camshaft in it and get the power it needs up on the motor to where it can actually take advantage of the extra head flow offered by a ported LS3 head. If you want to see what ported LS3 heads, take a look right here. I'll go ahead and put a link to the LS3 head test, and as you'll see, we can make a ton of power with a stock head and also even more power with ported LS3 heads, but only on a really big powerful combination. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay, 6.2 liter LS owners, you guys are officially prepared. Now you know what modifications work on your 6.2 liter L92, L99, and LS3. You know how they all work, right? If we take a look at it, obviously, camshaft is the go-to thing. And the reason for that is the 6.2 liter, whether it's an LS3 or an L92 or even an L99, they already have really good intake manifolds and they already have really good cylinder heads. So the only thing missing from the equation is camshaft. But let's not forget, long tube headers add power down low. If you are going to change the intake manifold and try to make something that's better than the factory LS3 intake manifold, good luck. You can pick up power at different parts of the RPM range, and make sure to check out that cross ram. Super cool looking. It also makes more power than factory intake almost everywhere. Now camshafts, if you're going to put a camshaft in, as you go up and up from stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, you pick up more and more power. But as we saw, what effect did it have on the torque curve? In the middle part of the torque curve, almost nothing. There are milder camshafts and they work equally well. What about cylinder heads? Yes, you can do ported cylinder heads. There's a lot of good ported cylinder heads out there from a lot of good guys, but make sure you have enough motor to take advantage of what those LS3 ported heads have to offer. I'm Richard Holder, guys. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff, and I will keep testing.